this video is to review the early presidents, because I feel like we spent more time with Washington and Adams, but it may have felt like we went quickly through Jefferson and Madison. So while we're in between chapters, until Thursday and Friday, I wanted to give you a chance to really kind of review the biggest ideas from these four presidents. We'll start all the way back with the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, as you know, were the first constitution. This was the first plan of government. They put it together. They passed the Articles of Confederation while they were in the process still of declaring their independence from Great Britain. And this was what organized their government during the Revolutionary War. The most important things to remember about the Articles of Confederation, that was a really weak central government. These are people who had dealt with a very strong monarch and who feared a strong monarch, and as a result wanted their central government to not be too strong. As a result, some of those weaknesses of the Articles, they couldn't enforce the laws, there was no executive, they couldn't actually collect taxes, they could just ask. When states went into disputes, there was no judiciary or Supreme Court to settle those disputes. We know they couldn't raise a national army because they couldn't afford to pay them because they weren't able to tax. All of that stuff are those weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And Shays' Rebellion, the big event that prompts them to turn around and have a constitutional convention where they end up writing the Constitution we have today. Remember, there was an economic crisis. Generally across America, people were struggling. Not only the national government, but the states were also in debt. There was a series of bad crops, and as a result, pretty much everyone was struggling to pay their debts, and state governments then imposed these high taxes. So when the states imposed high taxes, the farmers suffered especially because when they weren't able to pay their taxes, the states threatened to take their land. So you had that group of farmers who revolted, and the federal government proved to be embarrassingly weak. They weren't able to muster a national force to put down that rebellion. So at that point, they were like, we need to do something about that. We need a stronger federal government. So they convened the Constitutional Convention. Just the big things again, the reason they met was to revise the Articles, but they ended up writing a whole new Constitution, because remember that revising the Articles would have, or amending the Articles, would have required 13 out of 13 states to agree. That was built into the document. There were several things that led to a lot of differences. Their regional differences, like the South being largely agrarian or agricultural or farming people, and the North being more lending itself to trade, led to differences, but also just differences of beliefs. This is the beginning of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Remember, the Federalists who understood and really felt that need for a strong federal government, and those Anti-Federalists who were still very afraid of this president that could turn out to be king. So there needs to be quite a few compromises in order to get this done. Remember that what the small states wanted, they wanted equal representation so they wouldn't get swallowed up by big states, and they got what they wanted in the Senate. So the Congress ended up being bicameral, or two houses. The Senate, still today, has two representatives from each state. It's equal representation. The large states got what they wanted, that proportional representation in the House of Representatives. And then the other big compromise, the 3/5 compromise. Remember that the South wanted their slaves to count, because otherwise they would have not been able to be as effective in government as they were, and slaves are going to end up counting as 3/5 of a person. But just writing this new Constitution isn't enough. It has to get ratified and approved by the states. And the Constitution itself says that it needs to be approved in order to take effect. So we had two groups form as a result. We had the Federalists, who supported the Constitution, the strong federal government. They wanted to see it ratified. We had the Anti-Federalists, led by people like Patrick Henry, who feared that government. They feared a president that would turn into a monarch. And the solution, the compromise that they had, the solution was to add a Bill of Rights, because the Anti-Federalists feared that the strong federal government would infringe on their rights. By adding that Bill of Rights as the first 10 amendments, the Anti-Federalists agree to ratify it, and the Constitution becomes law. So we have Washington's presidency, our first president, of course. There's the irony of Washington, and we'll get to that when we talk about the rebellion he faced, the Whiskey Rebellion. He's elected in 1788, so under the first Articles of Confederation president, you have him, under the first constitutional president, the Constitution's passed in 1787, so he becomes president. He's elected twice. They're still facing the problem of needing to pay off the national debt, and the states needing to pay off their own debts, help the American economy begin to recover from this slump that it's been in since the war and since the series of depressions that they faced, and to keep these states together. So you should remember his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and his 4-point plan. All of these things are very federalist measures. These are active things that the federal government can do to try to improve the economy, and that really sums up what the Federalists wanted. They were the very opposite of laissez-faire. They were the opposite of Jefferson. They wanted to do things. Washington himself generally supported Federalist policies. He did the things that Alexander Hamilton wanted. So he wouldn't have identified himself as such because, he was anti-faction. He generally had Federalist tendencies. Make sure you remember those few things that Washington's farewell address warned against. Of course, he was against parties. He was right about foreign entanglements, excessive spending and debt, and he warned us against an overly large military. Now, I left out the Whiskey Rebellion. I'm a fool, of course. Remember that under Shays' Rebellion, the federal government was weak and unable to act decisively to stop them, and it was dependent on the militia in Massachusetts. So in the Whiskey Rebellion, you had a similar idea. These backcountry farmers that had tended to make more money off of turning their excess grain into whiskey and selling that than they had off of some of their farmland. So they were in the habit of doing that, and his legislature passed this law which taxed that whiskey and upset them. So that's what this is trying to point out to you. They're criticizing Washington for, in 1776, he commanded his militia against Great Britain for taxing, and then in 1794, here he is enforcing taxation. Now, you know that there's a difference between this. The reason they were mad is because they were being taxed, but they didn't have representation in Parliament. Whereas here, the states have representation in the legislative branch, and they voted for this tax. Maybe the South may not have voted for the tax, but generally it was passed by a legislative body in which they had representation. But that's worth remembering. This is just real quick because I know that some people still struggle, especially with the two-party system, the most important things about them. I'm not going to read it to you. You can look at it. Really, this is something that you just need to commit to memory. If you copy it down in a notable place in your notebook, you'll be able to refer back to it. We're going to move into a different set of parties very soon. We're going to see these parties morph. You know that the Federalists generally disappear when they decide at the Hartford Convention when they start talking about at the Hartford Convention seceding from the Union, they're going to appear quite disloyal when Mr. Madison's war, the War of 1812, comes to an end. So that's really going to be the final nail in the coffin for them. But they will be replaced by another party. But it's this distinction between these two groups still kind of is at the heart of our party system today. So worth knowing about. Let's talk about Adams. The most important things you need to remember about Adams' presidency. Adams is a Federalist. Please remember that. He's elected one time in 1796 after Washington voluntarily chooses to serve only 2 terms. Adams was all about neutrality. He really wanted to avoid getting involved in the conflict between Great Britain and France. But because he's a Federalist, he's generally going to support Great Britain for a couple of reasons. I guess that's worth talking about. Remember that traders and the manufacturers in New England had long had a relationship with Great Britain, and you might think that they would still be mad about the whole Revolutionary War thing, but they wanted quickly after the Revolutionary War to get back to trading because what they really want is money, and they've got these established partnerships with British companies. So the Federalists are going to find themselves supporting England. The other reason they're afraid of France is that in France, you should remember vaguely from the French Revolution that France were true believers in democracy, but they also then began beheading wealthy people. You had a lot of angry poor people in France who began beheading the rich. So the Federalists who tend to be wealthier are going to find themselves a little afraid of France. So he wants to maintain neutrality, but he's leaning towards Great Britain. We have the XYZ affair. He sends his delegates to meet with Talleyrand, the French minister. He's like the French Secretary of State. A lot of you said that he was the French leader. He is not. He's not the French leader. He is a Secretary of State. And, of course, Talleyrand says, no, I'm not willing to meet with you unless you will pay a bribe. And we also want a multi-million-dollar loan. And, of course, America is outraged at this demand that we would pay any kind of money to another group in order to negotiate. As in response to this XYZ affair, you know that Adams is going to turn around and increase the size of the military, and we're going to end up having this 2 years of undeclared kind of naval conflict with France, what we called the quasi-war. The two most significant domestic events that are going to take place under Adams are the Alien Act and Sedition Act. The Alien Act, remember the purpose of it, we're talking about aliens, we're talking about people who are not native to this country. So this is going to increase the process of naturalization, which if you don't remember is how you become a citizen. It's going to increase the requirement from 5 years to 14 years. Currently it's 5 years. It was 5 years then, and he made it so you had to be there 14 years just in order to even become a citizen. Consider that you have to be a citizen in order to vote. So if, like the most Federalists, Adams was afraid of the French and afraid of French influences, the point of that then was to keep the French who were coming over from becoming citizens who had influence in Congress. Also, you would expect that since the Republicans generally support the French, any French person who came over and became a citizen would tend to support the Republicans. So this was really targeted at French immigrants and kind of back channel targeted at the Republicans. But the Sedition Act is targeted squarely at Republicans. Anyone who dares to speak out against the government at this point, remember, sedition is criticizing the government. The Federalist Congress passes this law that makes speaking against the government illegal, which is a huge deal because this violates our First Amendment right. And this Bill of Rights was not added to the Constitution so long ago. So this is the first incident where we really have a law that violates the Constitution. Now, we don't have judicial review yet. We're not going to get judicial review until 1803 with Marbury v. Madison. So you don't have a Supreme Court whose job it is to declare laws like this unconstitutional, but you're going to see the states are going to take on that role. So this is going to be largely targeted at those Republicans who dare to criticize the Federalists and dare to criticize specifically John Adams's policies. Here we get to states' rights. This is important to me, not so much at this time, but because you're going to see a trend throughout the next 20 or 30 years whereby you're going to see this idea of states' rights coming up again and again. So the question at hand is, do states have the right to nullify or fail to enforce, refuse to and enforce laws that have been passed by Congress? And the question here was about the Alien and Sedition Acts, because both Virginia and Kentucky argued that this Sedition Act violated the First Amendment, and as a result, they shouldn't have to enforce it. Now, in Virginia and Kentucky, both of which were Republican strongholds, of course, they're deep South, that's planter country, that's farmer country. Jefferson and Madison are really behind this. They're going to pass resolutions. Remember, that's when your assembly meets together. In their case, their state Congress meets together. And a resolution is just a statement of your opinion on something that you pass as an assembly. So they're going to pass these resolutions, which are going to nullify or refuse to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts because of their unconstitutionality. Nothing really comes of it. I told you that no other states really back up Virginia and Kentucky. And when Jefferson takes office, he's going to repeal, or he's going to see both of these laws repealed as the Republicans take power. So not a lot comes of this, but it's going to become very important later when southern states especially, start declaring that they have the right to nullify laws that deny them their right to own slaves. So you're going to see this come again. We're going to see a nullification crisis in the 30s. I'm not going to talk too much about Jefferson because we just learned Jefferson, but hopefully this gave you a good reminder, overview of the most important events in the first half of this quarter and the first 4 presidents or so.